Tonight, delay for a deal. The president pushing back his overseas trip for a trip to Capitol Hill.
Mr. President, are you going to have a bill in hand?
In order to head to Rome and then to Glasgow with a multi-trillion-dollar framework in hand.
Pay your fair share.
Plus, the economy grows, but not by enough as the latest jobless numbers come in. And
I'm an intersex person, and I had rights as such.
The first person to receive an X on their U.S. passport, bypassing the checkbox for male or female. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Let's get this done. President Biden's parting words before traveling overseas. Good evening and welcome to Faith Nation. I'm John Jessup. The president delaying his departure to a pair of global summits so he could first visit the U.S. Capitol to tout the framework of a deal on his Build Back Better agenda. After months of intense negotiations, Mr. Biden plainly telling fellow Democrats he needs their votes. The nearly $2 trillion plan would invest in families and clean energy. The big question? How to pay for it. CBN's Brody Carter is following the developments on Capitol Hill. Brody, we're already seeing some support splintering.
Well, John, it's not a done deal. This framework could push that plan closer to the finish line. Still, it's clear it took wheeling and dealing behind closed doors with key Democrats to get to this point.
No one got everything they wanted, including me. But that's what compromise is.
President Biden put his travel plans on hold to plead with Democrats to finalize this compromise of the bill, which has basically been cut in half from $3.5 trillion over 10 years to an estimated $1.75 trillion.
The agenda that's in these bills is what 81 million Americans voted for.
Holdouts like Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema agreed on key points, which include more than $500 billion to fight climate change, and on the social side, providing universal pre-K, extending the child tax credit for a year, and measures Democrats say will reduce health care premiums and in-home care waiting lists.
These are not about left versus right, or moderate versus progressive, or anything else that pits Americans against one another. This is about competitiveness versus complacency. It's about leading the world or letting the world pass us by.
Democrats are still working out how to pay for the new spending. The highlights include proposed new taxes that would hit businesses, including a 15% minimum for many large corporations and 15% profits from other countries. Wealthy individuals making more than $10 million annually will be hit, and IRS enforcement will be increased. Mr. Biden acknowledged that some parts of his agenda will not get done in the current round of legislation, including free community college and federal paid family leave, along with lowering prescription drug prices. John, back to you.
All right, thank you, CBN's Brody Carter. For more now, we turn to CBN News Chief Political Analyst David Brody. David, with the framework announced, more legislative text being dished out even right now into the evening hours, no Republican buy-in, and dubious support from progressive Democrats who complain a lot of their priorities are missing in the $1.7 trillion plan. David, how far is this from a done deal?
Oh, it's very far from a done deal for all those reasons you mentioned, John. Look, we're getting word that there's about 2,400 pages or so, a little bit more. That, of course, is in the committee stage, and then eventually will go to the floor. The sense here is that Nancy Pelosi will hold some sort of vote later this evening, and there's also a sense that she will hold the vote open. In other words, let it rip. She's on the House floor, the bill's on the House floor, and it just stays open until they can actually get the amount of congressmen, Democrats specifically, to pass this bill. That's kind of where we're at, and it's interesting. But I got to tell you, ultimately, they've got a lot of work to do. Those progressives just are not happy, and they've got to have that infrastructure bill, the hard infrastructure bill, along with the reconciliation bill together. They need two votes back to back. That's what they want.
Well, David, as you're just talking about, the framework is attached to the long-stalled bipartisan infrastructure deal. Do the Democrats even have enough votes to pass infrastructure by the time President Biden lands in Italy to meet with the Pope?
No, I don't think so. That's not going to happen. I think it's going to be very, very difficult. Because remember, even if the House passes it, then it's got to go into a reconciliation, or I say reconciliation, it's got to go into a committee with the Senate to work out differences in both bills. There are going to be a few differences. And so it'll be very hard. And even if there weren't any differences, let's say the House passed the Senate bill, it's still going to be very, very tight for Biden to actually have an actual victory to proclaim. I don't see it happening, John, at all.
So, David, as far as Washington's composition, Democrats control the House, they control the Senate and the White House. What does the outcome of these spending bills say about their ability to govern?
Well, you know, this is the problem when you have all three branches of government, or excuse me, all three, you have Senate, House, and White House, and you're not able to get much done. As a matter of fact, it was Joe Biden who's told Democrats today on the Hill, look, we're going to be out of the majority in the Senate if we don't get this done. And my presidency, those were the words he used, my presidency will be over after one term if we don't get this done. And Nancy Pelosi actually saying today to Democrats as well to say, look, do not embarrass the president by when I put this on the House floor to not vote for it. Basically, it's got to pass. We don't want to embarrass the president when he's overseas. That's kind of what it's come down to. It's a clown car kind of all over the place right now.
That context about the foreign diplomacy and how that weighs into the domestic agenda, very, very astute there. Thank you. CBN's chief political analyst, David Brody. Thanks, David.
You bet.
Well, slow going tonight on the economic front. The U.S. economy on pace for the worst quarter so far in the COVID recovery. The nation's gross domestic product, or total output, declining sharply from the 6% growth rate of the previous 2 quarters in the recovery. The 2% growth this quarter, well below the 2.8% annual rate economists were expecting between July and September. The good news, jobless claims hit a new pandemic-era low at just 281,000 claims. Economists blame the Delta variant and supply chain shortages for taking a major bite out of economic growth. And with confirmed cases declining and more Americans venturing out to spend as we approach the holidays, there is hope, though, for a GDP bounce back in the final quarter of the year. Well, joining me now, Mark HAMRICK, Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Economic Analyst at BANKRATE. Mark, nice to see you again tonight. Democrats, as we just mentioned, announced that framework for President Biden's spending plan. Does it look like they're going to raise enough money to pay for this? And secondly, what effect will the trillions in spending have on the economy?
Well, first of all, John, good to be with you. That's what the supporters of the bill are saying, and until the text of the legislation is seeing the full light of day, that's all we have to go by for the moment. But that's a step in a direction that Washington hasn't tended to lean toward in recent years. So I would say, we'll take that as at least a victory in the direction of fiscal prudence. So that could be scored as, a win just for those who are concerned about burgeoning debt and deficits. I think the more important question, John, in terms of the direction of the economy really is, does the infrastructure bill get passed? Because we know we do have continuing challenges with the crumbling roads, bridges, highways, et cetera, in this country. But in terms of addressing the climate, that is a key issue in the legislation that you're referencing at the top. And really, we've seen precious little coming out of Washington to address this increasingly critical issue for the planet. And so I think that that is an issue which most Americans, by the way, a majority of Americans are concerned about. And therefore, whether it's politically or perhaps siding with some aspect of science, that does affect the economy. And that is something to watch as well.
Mark, today's less than stellar economic report attributed to the Delta variant, as we mentioned, supply chain issues, among other things. Mark, some argued failing to extend those unemployment benefits would lead to stalling out the economy. Do those arguments, in your opinion, have any merit?
No, that's totally unrelated, John. The supply chain disruptions are omnipresent. And really what we have in the economy right now is a supply issue with respect to workers as well as essentially goods. We had 4 straight quarters of 4% or better GDP. Remember, in the second quarter of early last year, we had an annualized decline of more than 30%. And so we're still working to essentially repair that damage. And the expectation, at least for now, is that in the current fourth quarter, we will get back above an annualized rate of 4%. The long-term trend for the U.S. economy has tended to be judged around 1.8 to 2%. So it is disappointing. It's below the recent trend. And we're also really not operating at potential because there is sufficient demand. There's not enough supply.
You may have hinted at this a little bit in your answer. You know, amid today's report from the Commerce Department showing that slower economic growth, there is good news on the jobs front, and there are general expectations that the economy will pick up again in the fourth quarter. What do you see? Do you agree with that?
I do, but you know, the supply chain issue has been one that has essentially caught us by surprise. It seems that it's actually easier to close down the economy than to open it back up. And we still have consumers and businesses who have been broadly focused on goods and not services. If we get international travel jump-started, if we can have business travel resume, if we have people doing essentially all the things they did before the pandemic, at least to some degree, that will help to get this in a better situation. Essentially, people want to buy lots of things, and all those things they want to buy, they're not available. And if that sort of gets into a better position here in the final months of the year, including as we get into the holiday season, we'll see. But obviously, inflation, supply chain disruptions, all of that has been much worse than anybody could see coming.
Some things are just too difficult to predict. Mark HAMRICK, thank you so much for your time. We always appreciate your insights.
Thank you, John.
Turning overseas, Taiwan's president says the threat from China grows every day, confirming for the first time the presence of American troops on Taiwanese soil. That's not the only alarming revelation. China also recently test-launched an hypersonic weapon capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. America's top general, in an interview with Bloomberg News, compared the hypersonic weaponry, which the U.S. cannot now detect or defeat, to the launch of the game-changing Soviet Sputnik satellite. That gave the USSR an edge in the space race back in 1957.
It was a very significant event of a test of a hypersonic weapon system. And it is very concerning. I don't know if it's quite a Sputnik moment, but I think it's very close to that.
General Milley adding that the new weapon is, quote, an enormous change in the character of war. Coming up, the U.S. issues a genderless passport, the new option that allows bypassing checkboxes for male or female. Welcome back. A farce that flaunts God. That's Franklin Graham's response to the State Department's historic move after issuing its first non-binary passport. The pass holder doesn't identify as male or female, instead marked X for gender.
I'm an intersex person, you know, and I had rights as such.
Dana Zim, now the first person to receive a non-binary passport. Zim, a Colorado intersex activist, battled the State Department since 2015 for the designation, a move seen as an affront to those with a biblical worldview on sexuality.
They're putting the stamp of human rights on people's thoughts on what is moral when this is actually immoral.
At the same time, Republican-led states like Texas are pushing back. Governor Greg Abbott this week signed a bill requiring public school athletes to compete based on their biological sex. 5 other states have similar laws. Well, with me now, Tony Perkins, president of the Family Research Council. Tony, good to have you back tonight. Abigail Schreier, there we go, an author with whom I'm sure you're familiar. She writes about gender issues, and she described the new State Department policy as gender ideology infiltrating the highest levels of government. Tony, do you see it that way? And with policies like this, what might we expect next?
There is a conflation of issues here, which is designed to be this way by the State Department. There are truly, I would say, issues of intersex individuals, but we have to realize that that's less than a 10%, less than a tenth of 1% of the population of those that are born that way. So very small. That's what's leading on this, but the State Department is saying, well, we're going to open this up to gender fluid, non-conforming, non-binary individuals. So this truly is a bigger part of their gender ideology push. But
I think the timing of this is more of a classic wag the dog. I mean, look at what's happening in our nation right now. Rising inflation. Some are worried about how if we could be headed toward hyperinflation. We just heard about, we're at one of these Sputnik moments. We have this historic surge at our southern border of illegal immigrants coming into the country, rising prices. The consumers are being hit by all of this. And so what do? This administration wants to deflect away from the real policies and do stuff like this. And of course, last week celebrating the first transgender admiral. This is the kind of stuff this administration is committed to advancing. Things that, a little bit of a favor here for their base, but for the rest of America, it is devastating.
Tony, I appreciate you parsing into a little bit of the nuance there with the intersex individual that we were just reporting on. I do want to ask you, though, what about security considerations? Is it problematic that identity cards may no longer correspond to a person's outward appearance?
Well, John, that's a good question. Why do we have identity cards? It's so we can identify people. Why are we concerned about security? Why do you have to present an ID when you go into an airport? Look, I was a police officer for years. And, when we would have a suspect, we would say we have a white male. We would have a black female. So what do we say now? We have a white X. What does that mean? This is a part of sowing confusion and the deconstruction. So I think we have to look at this very objectively. There are legitimate issues, but they attach to a legitimate issue an agenda. And that's what we're seeing coming forth from this administration, sowing these seeds of confusion. And John, by the way, this is in the State Department with passports, but I think every American should be even more concerned on what they're doing in our schools in America, because that's where the battle is really taking place.
Tony, I wish we had more time. I'm sure we could talk about this and many other topics, but unfortunately our time is up. Tony Perkins with the Family Research Council, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, John.
When we come back, a major tool used in the fight against international religious persecution is set to expire. How that's bringing lawmakers on both sides of the aisle together. Welcome back. Though bipartisanship today is rare, one issue that's uniting liberal and conservative lawmakers in Washington is the fight for human rights. CBN senior Washington correspondent Jennifer Wishon reports on their efforts to prevent a law from expiring that holds accountable those who abuse people over their faith.
Working to stop abuses against Christians and the world's other religious minorities isn't easy. One tool that helps is the Global Magnitsky Act, known as GLOMAG, which allows the U.S. to keep bad actors from enjoying many of the benefits of the West.
It's named for Sergei Magnitsky, a Ukrainian lawyer tortured and killed after exposing corruption at the Kremlin. Passed in 2012, the act is routinely used to punish these international wrongdoers, imposing asset freezes, visa bans, and restrictions on doing business with Americans.
Targeted sanctions can send a strong message of solidarity with victims and provide some accountability when judicial mechanisms fail.
Advocates say the Magnitsky list isn't one human and religious rights abusers want to be on.
We know it was one of the first issues mentioned during the summit between President Putin and Trump. We know that individuals do not want to get on that list. They don't want to be named and shamed.
In 2017, President Trump signed an executive order that goes even further, authorizing sanctions on any foreign person responsible or complicit in human rights abuses or corruption, a move even his biggest detractors applauded.
Most of the people who are listening here today probably know that I'm a very, very liberal Democrat. There were not many things that I agree with former President Trump on, but I did agree with his decision to issue Executive Order 13818.
Now, with GLOMAG set to expire next year, lawmakers want to make the Magnitsky Act permanent, incorporate President Trump's executive order, and expand it to other countries.
The bottom line is no oligarch, no crony should be able to escape sanctions because they're too big. We need to be able to act with unity in the international community to advance the protections of human dignity.
Last year, 8 senior Chinese officials were sanctioned under the act
for their direct participation in surveillance, mass detention, and forced labor of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in the Uyghur region.
Still, the sanctions account for a small percentage of religious freedom violations occurring globally, something officials like Turkel want to see changed. GLOMAG sanctions were used to pressure Turkey to release Christian pastor Andrew Brunson, but the move also raised questions.
These sanctions against Turkish officials helped expedite his welcome release from arbitrary detention, but focusing on one victim and not including other similarly situated Turkish or American citizens who are also arbitrarily detained in Turkey's prisons, raised questions about the implementation of the sanctions program.
Working to advance and protect religious freedom is a priority for the U.S. for a very simple reason.
Those who violate religious freedom is just indicative of so many other abuses that occur in that country.
Religious freedom is a foundational pillar of any free and open society. Religious freedom stands as a basic human right, alongside freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and the right to petition one's government.
And as the expiration of GLOMAG gets closer, this bipartisan group of lawmakers and others are already working to make sure it gets expanded and made permanent. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. Pastor and author Max Lucado announcing some personal good news. See who he's giving credit, along with giving glory to God. And finally tonight, good news for Bible teacher and prolific best-selling author Max Lucado. Past summer, Lucado publicly revealed he developed a large bulge in a major blood vessel close to his heart, which likely required surgery. This week, Lucado announced new tests show the aneurysm has actually shrunk, so much so that he doesn't need to go in for a follow-up for another year. While doctors cite a more precise test for the good news, Lucado credits God and people's prayers. Good news for him, and just really grateful that it's working out that way. Thank you so much for watching tonight's edition of Faith Nation. We hope to see you right back here tomorrow.